They say the West was built on grit, but they never tell you what grit is really made of. It's not just sweat and dust, it's secrets. It's the things you bury, hoping they'll never see the sun again. And in a town like Prescott, Arizona, the ground was full of them. The sun was a hammer that July, pounding the dust into a fine choking powder. The wind didn't offer relief, it just carried the heat from one miserable corner of town to the next. When Hannah Cooper stepped off that stagecoach, the whole street stopped to watch. It wasn't just the trunk she carried like it was nothing. It was her. She was tall. Not just tall for a woman, but tall for a man. Her shoulders were broad, her hands looked like they knew what work was, and she carried herself with a stillness that made people uncomfortable. She'd heard the whispers her whole life. Too big, too strong, too much. The men lining the street, all rolled sleeves and sunburned necks, paused their whittling and spitting just long enough to pass judgment. But Hannah didn't flinch. She couldn't afford to. She'd come here chasing her very last hope, a piece of paper with a promise on it, a housekeeping job for the Henderson family. It meant a roof. It meant food. It was the only card she had left to play. She walked straight to the Henderson house, a big, imposing structure that seemed to sneer down at the rest of the town. She knocked. The door opened just a crack, and a woman's face, pinched tighter than a miser's fist, peered out. Mrs. Henderson. The woman's eyes traveled up and then down, and a sour little curl formed on her lip. "We've already hired someone," she snapped, the words like stones. She didn't ask Hannah's name, didn't care about the letter in her hand. The door clicked shut, the sound echoing in the oppressive heat. One glance, one judgment. That's all it ever took. Hannah stood there on that porch for a full minute, maybe two. The heat pressed in, wilting her collar. Her trunk sat in the dust where she'd left it. Every man on that street was waiting, waiting for the tears, waiting for her to crumble, to pick up her trunk and to slink away defeated. But Hannah didn't move. She just stood there, breathing, a statue carved from defiance. And that's when a man watching from the shadows of the saloon took notice. He wasn't looking at her size, or the worn dress, or the exhaustion in her eyes. He was looking at her stillness. He watched her absorb the entire town's scorn without so much as blinking. He pushed himself off the wall, his spurs making no sound in the thick dust, and started walking toward her. He wasn't a lawman, wasn't a rancher. He was something else, something quiet and dangerous. He stopped a few feet away, his face unreadable under the brim of his hat. He didn't offer sympathy. He didn't offer a room. He just looked her dead in the eye and said, in a voice as dry as the dirt beneath their feet, "I know who you are." Hannah's blood ran cold. The heat, the staring eyes of the townsfolk, the slammed door. It all vanished. Those 4 words were more terrifying than anything she'd faced all day. She'd come to Prescott to disappear, to become a ghost. But this man, this stranger, had just told her it was already too late. He took another step closer, his voice dropping to a whisper no one else could hear. "And if you want to stay alive, you'll come with me, right now." What do you do when your last hope evaporates and a new, terrifying one takes its place? You don't think. You act. Hannah looked at the man's eyes. They weren't kind. They weren't cruel. They were like 2 chips of flint, promising nothing but a hard reality. She looked back at the Henderson house, at the closed door that represented a world that would never have her. Then she looked back at the stranger. She gave a single, sharp nod. His name was Eli Walker. He didn't offer to take her trunk. He just turned and started walking toward a pair of horses tied to a hitching rail at the far end of the street. Hannah hoisted her trunk onto her shoulder without a grunt and followed him. The townsfolk watched them go, their whispers following them like flies. They weren't just curious anymore. Now they were afraid. The ride out of town was silent and brutal. The trail climbed out of the dusty bowl of Prescott and into the jagged hills, where the pines grew sparse and the rocks looked like broken teeth. Eli rode ahead, never looking back, his posture rigid. Hannah followed, her mind racing. Who was he? How could he possibly know who she was? She'd used a different name on her application, traveled a winding route to get here. She was supposed to be invisible. The man she was running from was a ghost in her past, a powerful man with a long reach. A man who had told her he'd see her dead before he saw her free. Had he found her already? Was this Eli Walker a friend, or was he the man sent to finish the job? Every snap of a twig, every call of a bird, made the muscles in her back tighten. After what felt like hours, Eli's cabin came into view. It wasn't a home, it was a fortress. It was built squat and low against a rock face, with narrow windows that looked more like slits for a rifle. A small, sturdy barn stood nearby, and the whole property was encircled by a fence that looked strong enough to stop a charging bull. This wasn't the quiet homestead of a lonely rancher. This was the hideout of a man expecting a war. Eli dismounted and opened the cabin door, holding it for her. He still hadn't said another word since his cryptic warning in town. Hannah hesitated, her hand clutching the handle of her trunk. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice raspy. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. It wasn't pity, it was recognition, like he was looking at a fellow soldier. "Because the Hendersons are liars," he said, his voice flat, "and anyone they turn away this fast is someone I need to know." He gestured with his head toward the dark interior of the cabin. "They're not the ones you should be afraid of. The real trouble hasn't found you yet, but it's coming." The inside of the cabin was sparse and clean, smelling of wood smoke and coffee. A table, 2 chairs, a stone fireplace. But Hannah's eyes were drawn to the back wall. There, set into the floor, was a heavy wooden door, a cellar door. It wasn't just closed, it was secured with a thick iron bar bolted into the floorboards. It wasn't meant to keep things out, it was meant to keep something in. Hannah put her trunk down, the sound echoing in the silent cabin. She pointed a trembling finger at the door. "What's down there?" Eli's face went hard, the brief moment of connection gone. He walked over and stood between her and the door, a human wall. "That's the one rule of this house," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You don't ask about that door. You don't go near that door. You act like it doesn't exist. You understand me?" His intensity was frightening. It was a raw, jagged thing that filled the small space between them. Hannah could only nod, her throat suddenly too tight to speak. She had escaped one cage only to walk right into another, and she had no idea what kind of monster was locked in the basement beneath her feet. That night, sleep was a stranger. Hannah lay on a simple cot in a small side room, listening to the sounds of the house. The wind howled outside, clawing at the roof. The floorboards creaked under Eli's restless pacing in the main room. And underneath it all, she imagined she could hear another sound, a faint scratching, coming from below the floor. Was it real? Or was it just her fear given a voice? The next few days passed in a tense, unspoken truce. They worked. From sunup to sundown, they mended fences, chopped wood, hauled water. Eli was a machine, moving with a grim efficiency that left no room for conversation. He showed her a task once, then expected her to do it perfectly from then on. It was hard, punishing labor, but Hannah welcomed it. The ache in her muscles was a welcome distraction from the terror coiling in her gut. She started noticing things, small, strange details that didn't add up. On the fence posts at the edge of the property, nearly hidden by weeds, were carved symbols, a spiral with a dot in the center, an arrow crossed with a jagged line. They weren't brands or trail markers. They felt older, ritualistic. When she asked Eli about them, he just grunted. "Keeps the coyotes away." But Hannah knew he was lying. Coyotes weren't afraid of symbols. People were. Then came the nights. Eli was plagued by nightmares. Hannah would wake to the sound of his thrashing in the other room, his voice thick with sleep and choked with horror. He'd cry out a name, over and over. "Silas!" He'd say it like a prayer, then like a curse. He'd talk about a fire, about smoke so thick you couldn't breathe, about the smell of burning pine and something else, something much worse. One morning after a particularly bad night, Hannah found him staring into the cold fireplace, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Who is Silas?" she asked, her voice soft. He spun around, his eyes wide and wild, and for a second, she thought he was going to strike her. The look on his face was one of pure animal panic. "I told you," he hissed, his voice a low growl. "No questions." He needed supplies from town. He announced it abruptly, saddling his horse with jerky, angry movements. He told her to stay put, bolt the door, and not open it for anyone. For anyone. As he rode off down the trail, Hannah stood on the porch, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. This was her chance to run. She could pack her trunk and be gone before he ever returned, disappear down some other dusty road. But where would she go? The memory of Mrs. Henderson's face, of the whole town's silent judgment, was still fresh. Out here, with the silent, haunted man and his locked cellar door, she was afraid. But back there, she was worthless. And then there was the other, more terrifying thought. What if Eli wasn't the danger? What if he was, as he claimed, her only protection? What if the real trouble was on its way, and she was safer inside this fortress than out in the open? She looked at the cellar door. The iron bar gleamed dully in the morning light. The scratching she'd imagined on the first night seemed to echo in her memory. No questions, he had said, but some questions demand answers, especially the ones that might save your life. She waited until the sound of his horse had completely faded. Then, her decision made, she walked not towards the road but towards the cellar door. She had to know what he was hiding. She knelt down, her fingers tracing the heavy iron bar. It was cold to the touch. The bolts holding it to the floor were thick, hammered in deep. There was no way to move it without tools, without making a racket. Defeated, she slumped back. But as her hand slid off the bolt, her fingers brushed against the floorboards next to it. One of them felt different, loose. Her breath caught. Slowly, carefully, she worked her fingernails into the crack. The board groaned in protest, then lifted. Underneath wasn't dirt. It was a hollow space, and nestled inside was a small leather-bound book, a journal. Her hands trembled as she lifted it out. The leather was old and worn, the pages filled with a cramped, spidery handwriting. She flipped it open. The first entry was dated 2 years prior. They followed me from Tucson. I saw them in the hills. They know about Silas. They know what I did. Hannah's blood turned to ice. She devoured the pages, her heart pounding with each new revelation. The journal belonged to Eli. It spoke of the fire, just as she'd heard in his nightmares. But this was no accident. It was a massacre, a mining camp called Black Creek Mine, a place not far from here. Eli and his brother Silas worked there. They had uncovered a secret, a massive gold smuggling operation run by a very powerful man. The journal named him Mr. Henderson, the man whose wife had slammed a door in her face. According to Eli's writing, Silas was going to expose him, but Henderson found out. He and his men set fire to the camp in the middle of the night, burning it to the ground, killing everyone inside to cover their tracks. Everyone except Eli. He had escaped, but Silas hadn't. I left him, the journal read, the words blurred as if by tears. I heard him screaming my name, and I ran. I ran, and I never looked back. It all clicked into place. The fortress-like cabin, the paranoia, the nightmares. Eli wasn't a killer. He was a survivor, the only witness to a mass murder, hiding from the man who orchestrated it. And that man was the patriarch of Prescott, the man who owned the town, the man whose wife had taken one look at Hannah and decided she was a threat. But why? Why her? She flipped to the last entry, dated just a few days before her arrival. The handwriting was shaky, almost illegible. A new housekeeper is coming. Henderson hired her. She must be one of them. An assassin, sent to finish the job. I will be ready for her. I will not run this time. Hannah dropped the journal as if it were on fire. He hadn't rescued her. He hadn't seen a kindred spirit. He had seen a killer. He had brought her here not to protect her, but to watch her, to wait for her to make her move. He thought she was here to murder him, and he was still in possession of a rifle, a pistol, and a lifetime of paranoia. He was on his way back right now. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She had to get out. She scrambled to her feet, grabbing the journal. She had to take it. It was the only proof. She shoved it into the pocket of her dress and ran for the door, her only thought to get to the barn, get a horse, and ride as far and as fast as she could. She fumbled with the bolt on the cabin door, her fingers slick with sweat. She threw it open and sprinted out into the yard, not daring to look back. She was halfway to the barn when a voice stopped her dead in her tracks. "Leaving so soon?" It wasn't Eli. Standing by the fence, calmly leaning against a post, was the town deputy, the young, clean-faced man she'd seen in Prescott. But he wasn't clean-faced anymore. There was a cruel smirk on his lips, and his hand was resting casually on the butt of his pistol. And he wasn't alone. With him were three other men, the same kind of rough, dusty characters she'd seen lining the streets. They spread out, blocking her path. "Mr. Henderson was very disappointed when you didn't just leave town," the deputy said, his voice light and conversational. It made him sound even more menacing. "He sent us to persuade you and to collect our property from Mr. Walker." He nodded toward the cabin. "Heard he's been having a hard time sleeping. We're here to help with that, permanently." The deputy took a step forward. "Now you can either be a smart girl and tell us where he keeps his brother's little book, or we can do this the hard way. Your choice." Hannah's mind reeled. They were here for the journal, the one tucked into her dress. They thought she was working with Eli. They were going to kill them both. She was trapped between Henderson's men in front of her and the man inside the cabin who thought she was an assassin. There was nowhere to run. The deputy's smirk widened as he saw the terror on her face. "The hard way it is, then." He drew his gun. Time seemed to slow down. The glint of sun on the pistol's barrel, the hungry look in the men's eyes, the crushing realization that this was it. This was how it ended. Then a sound split the air. Not a gunshot. A single, sharp word. "Drop it." The voice came from the cabin doorway. It was Eli. He stood there, rifle in hand, leveled directly at the deputy's chest. His face was a mask of cold fury. He had come back early. "I knew you were one of them," he snarled, his eyes fixed on Hannah, "leading them right to my door." The deputy chuckled, not lowering his weapon. "See, Walker? She played you for a fool. Now you're going to give us that ledger your brother was too stupid to burn, and we're going to let you die quick." It was a standoff. Henderson's men against a man who thought he was fighting alongside his own executioner. Hannah was caught in the middle, a pawn in a game she had only just begun to understand. The journal in her pocket felt like a lead weight, pulling her down into the grave they were all digging for each other. "The journal is gone," Eli lied, his voice steady despite the impossible odds. "Burned with my brother." "We'll be the judge of that," the deputy said, his thumb pulling back the hammer on his pistol. The click was deafeningly loud in the sudden silence. This was the moment, the trigger pull, the flash, the end. But before the deputy could fire, Hannah did the only thing she could think of. She screamed, "The cellar!" Every head turned. The deputy's eyes widened with confusion. Eli's face tightened, a new kind of horror dawning in his eyes. He thought she was revealing his secret, his last line of defense. "There's nothing in the cellar," he yelled, a desperate edge to his voice. "Isn't there?" Hannah pressed, her mind racing, weaving a lie from the threads of his fear. "That's where you told me to hide it. The real journal, the one with Henderson's signature on every page." It was a wild gamble, a complete shot in the dark, based on nothing but a locked door and a man's terror. But she saw a flicker of doubt in the deputy's eyes. Greed was a more powerful motivator than loyalty. He wanted that ledger, the one that implicated his boss, maybe to use for his own blackmail later. "Open it," the deputy commanded, gesturing toward the cabin with his pistol. "Now." Eli looked at Hannah, his expression a storm of betrayal and confusion. "You have no idea what you've done," he whispered. The words meant only for her. Then slowly, deliberately, he lowered his rifle and walked back into the cabin. The deputy and two of his men followed, their guns trained on his back, leaving one man outside to guard Hannah. Hannah's heart hammered against her ribs. What had she unleashed? What was really behind that door? She listened as the heavy iron bar was scraped back. She heard the groan of wood as the cellar door was lifted. And then she heard the screaming. It wasn't a scream of pain. It was a scream of pure, mind-shattering terror. It came from the deputy. It was followed by a wet, tearing sound and another scream, cut short in a sickening gurgle. Then another. The man guarding her stared at the cabin, his face white. He took a hesitant step toward the door, his gun wavering. What in God's name? From the dark doorway of the cabin, something emerged. It moved with an unnatural skittering speed. It was a man, but he was twisted, emaciated, his limbs bent at odd angles. His skin was pale as bone, his eyes were wide, black pits of madness, and his mouth was a bloody smear. He was covered in filth and gore. In his hand, he clutched a shard of broken wood, sharpened to a deadly point. The guard froze, his mouth agape. The creature that was once a man launched itself at him, the wooden shiv plunging deep into his throat. The guard fell without a sound. Hannah stood paralyzed. This was the secret in the cellar. This was the source of the scratching, the reason for the iron bar. The creature turned its head slowly, its black eyes fixing on her. A low, guttural growl rumbled in its chest. It started to shamble towards her. From the cabin, Eli staggered out. Blood splattered across his face. He held his rifle, but his hands were shaking. "Silas!" he choked out. "No!" The creature, Silas, paused. It looked at Eli. For a fleeting moment, a flicker of recognition seemed to cross its features. The growl softened. And in that moment, Hannah understood the full, horrifying truth. Eli hadn't run and left his brother to die in the fire. He had pulled him out. But Silas was too far gone. The fire hadn't just burned his body, it had cooked his mind, leaving behind nothing but a feral, violent shell. Eli hadn't been hiding from Henderson's men all this time. He had been hiding his brother, imprisoning him, trying to protect the world from the monster his brother had become, and maybe, just maybe, hoping he could still save him. The moment of recognition passed. Silas let out a shrieking roar and charged at Eli. Eli raised his rifle, his face a mask of agony. He couldn't do it. He couldn't shoot his own brother. He was going to die. They were both going to die. Without thinking, Hannah grabbed the fallen guard's pistol from the dust. Her hands were steady. Her aim was true. She had spent a lifetime being told she was too much, too strong. Now she would use that strength. She fired. The shot echoed through the hills. Silas stumbled, a look of surprise on his twisted face, before collapsing into a heap at Eli's feet. Silence descended. A heavy, profound silence, broken only by Eli's ragged, sobbing breaths. He fell to his knees beside his brother's body, the rifle slipping from his grasp. The long, terrible war he had been fighting was finally over. Hannah stood there, the pistol still hot in her hand, the smell of gunpowder sharp in the air. She looked at the bodies littering the yard, at the blood soaking into the dry Arizona dirt. She had come here looking for a safe place to hide. Instead, she had walked into hell, but she was still standing. She walked over to Eli, who was still kneeling, his shoulders shaking. She didn't say anything. She just stood beside him, a silent sentinel, as the sun began to dip below the ridge, casting long, bloody shadows across the land. The immediate danger was over, but the real threat was still out there. Mr. Henderson was still in Prescott, sitting in his fine house, waiting for his men to return. When they didn't, he would know something had gone wrong. He would know the witness he'd been hunting for 2 years was still alive. And now there was a new witness, her. They weren't safe. Not yet. The fight had only just begun. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Eli finally looked up, his eyes hollowed out by a grief so deep it seemed to have no bottom. He looked at the body of his brother, then at Hannah, the smoking pistol still in her hand. "You should have let him kill me," he whispered, his voice raw. "And then he would have killed me," Hannah replied, her own voice flat, devoid of emotion. That wasn't a choice. She knew he wasn't just talking about the physical threat. He was talking about the burden. For 2 years, he had been both a jailer and a protector to the last remnant of his family. He had chained a monster in his cellar, but he had done it out of a twisted, desperate love. He had fed him, cleaned up after him, and listened to his mindless rage, all while the guilt of his own survival ate him alive. And in one single moment, she had ended it. She had given him a release he could never give himself. He staggered to his feet, avoiding her eyes. Henderson will send more men, he said, his voice regaining a sliver of its old hard edge. He won't stop until the ledger is found and we're both in the ground. Then we don't wait for him to come to us, Hannah said, her resolve hardening into steel. She ejected the spent cartridge from the pistol and checked the remaining rounds. We take the fight to him. Eli stared at her, a new light dawning in his exhausted eyes. He had been hiding for so long, consumed by his secret, that the idea of fighting back seemed like a foreign concept. He had been reacting, surviving. He had forgotten how to attack. Just the two of us? He asked, a hint of disbelief in his tone. Against Henderson. He owns the town, the law, everything. He doesn't own this, Hannah said, gesturing to the carnage around them. This is proof. This is what he does to people who get in his way. We just need to show it to the right person. She pulled the journal from her dress. And we have this. A plan began to form, desperate and dangerous. They couldn't ride into Prescott. The deputy was Henderson's man, which meant the sheriff likely was too. They would be shot on sight. They needed an ally, someone outside of Henderson's control. Eli's eyes suddenly lit up with a faint spark. Traeger, he said, the name barely a whisper. Who's Traeger? An old prospector. Lives up in the high country, keeps to himself. But he used to be a U.S. Marshal. They say he retired after a bad shootout, but he never lost the instinct. Eli looked out towards the highest, most rugged peaks on the horizon. He hates men like Henderson. If anyone would listen, it's him. But finding him, that's another story. He doesn't like to be found. It was a slim chance, but it was the only one they had. They couldn't stay here. This place was a tomb now, haunted by too many ghosts. They worked through the twilight, their movements swift and silent. They wrapped the bodies of Silas and Henderson's men in canvas sheets and carried them to the barn, a temporary morgue. It was gruesome work, but it had to be done. They couldn't leave evidence for Henderson to clean up. Then they gathered what they would need: ammunition, water, food, and Eli's journal. As Hannah packed a saddlebag, her eyes fell on the strange symbols carved into the fence post, the spiral, the crossed arrow. Eli, she called out, her voice low. These symbols, you said they keep coyotes away. He paused, his back to her. It's just something my brother used to do. Superstitious nonsense. But Hannah was looking at the journal in her hands, then back at the symbol. She'd seen it before, not on the fence, but inside the book. In the margins of the last few pages, Silas had drawn them over and over again, next to lists of numbers and dates. It wasn't nonsense. It was a code. He wasn't just drawing them, Hannah said, her mind racing. He was trying to tell you something. Silas knew he was going to die. This was his last message to you. They lit a single lamp in the now silent cabin and hunched over the journal. For the first time, they were a team, their shared danger forging a bond between them. Hannah's sharp eyes, Eli's knowledge of his brother. Together, they worked to decipher the code. The symbols corresponded to words, the numbers to pages and lines in a book they found on Silas's shelf, a worn copy of Moby Dick. Slowly, painstakingly, a message emerged from the pages. It wasn't about the gold smuggling. It was about something far worse. Henderson wasn't just smuggling gold for profit. He was using the profits to buy up land that belonged to the local Yavapai tribe. But he wasn't just buying it. He was systematically driving them out, poisoning their water sources, using his hired guns to terrorize them, all to get at the rich veins of silver that ran beneath their sacred lands. The massacre at Black Creek Mine wasn't just to silence a whistleblower. It was to eliminate a group of miners who had started trading fairly with the Yavapai and threatened to expose Henderson's entire brutal operation. But that wasn't the final secret. The last line of the decoded message made the breath catch in Hannah's throat. The evidence is not in a book. It is in the earth, beneath the bitter root. He will never find it. Bitter root, Eli breathed, his face pale in the lamplight. That was his name for the old twisted oak tree on the western ridge, the one that was struck by lightning. They had it, the proof. Silas hadn't just kept a second ledger. He had buried it, along with Henderson's signed contracts and letters detailing his criminal conspiracy. It was the key to everything. But the western ridge was halfway to Traeger's territory, and they had to assume Henderson's men were already out there, sweeping the hills looking for them. They had to move now, under the cover of darkness. They saddled the two best horses, loaded their rifles, and prepared to leave the cabin behind forever. As they stood on the porch, ready to ride, Eli turned to Hannah. The moonlight softened the hard lines of his face. "I thought you were my enemy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was so lost in my own guilt. I couldn't see the truth right in front of me. Thank you." "We're not out of this yet," Hannah reminded him, though his words warmed a small, cold place in her heart. "I know." He reached out and placed a hand on her arm. His touch was firm, steady. "But for the first time in 2 years, I don't feel like I'm fighting alone." They mounted their horses and rode out, melting into the shadows of the pines. They were two fugitives, armed with a dead man's secret and a desperate hope. They were riding toward a lightning-scarred tree, a retired lawman, and a final bloody confrontation with the man who ruled Prescott. The ride was a nightmare of tension. Every shadow seemed to hold a rifleman. Every gust of wind sounded like an approaching horse. They stuck to the deep woods, avoiding the open trails, their horses picking their way carefully over the rocky, uneven ground. Eli led the way, his knowledge of these hills their only map. They rode for hours, the moon their only guide. Just as the first hint of dawn threatened to lighten the eastern sky, Eli reined in his horse, holding up a hand. "We're close," he whispered, pointing ahead. Through a break in the trees, on the crest of the next ridge, they could see it, a skeletal silhouette against the pre-dawn glow. A massive, twisted oak, its branches bare and blackened, reaching for the sky like charred fingers. The bitter root tree, but something was wrong. At the base of the tree, a small light flickered. A campfire. Someone was already there. Their hearts sank. Had Henderson figured it out? Had his men found the spot first? They dismounted, tethering their horses in a thicket of manzanita brush, and crept forward on foot, rifles at the ready. As they got closer, they could hear voices, low and rough. There were at least 3 of them, huddled around the fire. Eli and Hannah crawled to the edge of the clearing, hiding behind a granite boulder. They peered over the top. It wasn't Henderson's men. These men were Yavapai warriors, their faces grim, armed with rifles and bows. And they were digging frantically right at the base of the oak tree. Had Silas told them too? Were they allies? Before Eli could make a decision, a twig snapped behind them. They spun around, raising their rifles. An old man stood there, emerging from the shadows like a ghost. He was lean and weathered, with eyes that seemed to see right through them. He held an ancient-looking Sharps rifle, and it was aimed directly at Eli's heart. "You're a long way from your fortress, Walker," the old man said, his voice like gravel. "Looking for something?" "Traeger," Eli breathed, lowering his own weapon slightly. "We need your help." Traeger didn't lower his rifle. His eyes flicked to the Yavapai in the clearing. "Looks to me like you're about to get into a whole different kind of trouble. They've been watching this spot for 2 years. They believe your brother's spirit guards it." He looked back at Eli, his gaze sharp. "They're not wrong, are they? You tell me what you buried here before they put an arrow in all 3 of us." Just then, one of the warriors in the clearing stood up and pointed directly at them. He shouted something in his own language. The other 2 spun around, raising their weapons. They had been seen. They were caught. Caught between a legendary lawman who didn't trust them and a band of warriors who thought they were desecrating a sacred spot. The sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and it felt like it was illuminating their final moments on Earth. The Yavapai warriors advanced, their movements fluid and silent. Traeger didn't flinch, his rifle still trained on Eli. "Start talking, boy, fast." "Silas worked with them," Eli said, his words a rush torrent. "He was trying to help them, to prove Henderson was stealing their land. He buried the proof here. We have his journal. It explains everything." Traeger's eyes narrowed, searching Eli's face for the truth. The lead warrior, a man with a hawk-like nose and eyes that burned with cold fire, stopped 20 feet away, an arrow knocked in his bowstring. Hannah knew they had seconds. She stepped forward, deliberately placing herself between Eli and the warrior. She held her hands up, palms open, showing she was unarmed. "My name is Hannah Cooper," she said, her voice clear and strong, projecting across the clearing. "We did not come here to rob you. We came to seek justice for a man named Silas Walker and for all the people murdered at Black Creek Mine." She pulled the journal from her saddlebag and held it up. "The man who killed them is named Henderson. He is the same man who is poisoning your water and driving you from this land. This book is the beginning of the proof. The rest is in the ground. Silas left it for us and for you." The lead warrior stared at her, his expression unreadable. He exchanged a look with his men. He said something in their tongue. One of the others replied, gesturing angrily toward the hole they had dug. Traeger lowered his rifle a few inches. "The boy's name is Chayton," he said quietly to Eli. "His father was one of the men who died at the mine. He doesn't trust outsiders, especially not now." The ground beneath the tree had been disturbed before. Someone else had been digging here. That's why the warriors were here, investigating the sacrilege. But who? Suddenly a voice rang out from the woods behind the Yavapai. "Well, isn't this a touching reunion?" Everyone spun. Emerging from the trees was the corrupt deputy from Prescott, but he wasn't alone. With him was a dozen of Henderson's hired guns, a small army, forming a loose circle around the clearing, cutting off all escape. The deputy had a smug, triumphant look on his face. "I knew you'd lead us right to it," he said, nodding at the hole by the tree. "We've been searching this whole damn ridge for 2 years. Should have known Silas would get all sentimental." He looked at Traeger. "Drop it, old man. Your war is over." It was an ambush, a trap. The deputy had followed them, using them as bloodhounds to find the one thing Henderson needed to be destroyed. Traeger didn't drop his rifle. Chayton didn't lower his bow. Eli and Hannah stood back to back, their weapons up. It was an impossible standoff. 3 warriors, 1 retired lawman, and 2 fugitives against a dozen hardened killers. The deputy sighed dramatically. "I really hate it when things get messy." He raised his pistol. "Kill them all, and find me that box." The world erupted into a chaos of gunfire and screaming. Hannah dove behind the oak tree as bullets splintered the bark around her. Eli laid down suppressing fire, forcing 2 of the gunmen to take cover. Traeger, moving with the speed of a man half his age, dropped one of the henchmen with a single perfect shot from his Sharps rifle. The Yavapai warriors were magnificent. They faded back into the trees, silent as ghosts, their arrows finding their marks with deadly precision. But they were desperately outnumbered. One of them went down, a rifle bullet in his chest. Hannah knew they couldn't win a prolonged fight. Their only hope was the box. If she could just get to it, if she could just get it into Traeger's hands, maybe it would mean something. Maybe it would be enough. While Eli and Traeger pinned down the gunman, she crawled on her belly toward the hole the Yavapai had been digging. Dirt flew up around her as bullets thudded into the ground. She reached the edge of the hole and peered in. There, half buried in the loose soil, was a metal lockbox. She reached in, her fingers closing around the cold metal handle. It was heavy. She started to pull it out, but a shadow fell over her. She looked up into the smiling face of the deputy. He had circled around while everyone was distracted. "I'll take that," he said, leveling his pistol at her forehead. He didn't see Chayton rise from the bushes behind him, a hunting knife in his hand. The warrior moved without a sound. The deputy's eyes went wide with surprise as Chayton grabbed him, the blade flashing across his throat. The deputy collapsed without a sound, his smug smile frozen on his face. Chayton looked at Hannah, then at the box. He gave her a sharp, single nod. He believed her. Hannah scrambled out of the hole, clutching the box to her chest. "Traeger!" she screamed. "I have it!" But just as Traeger turned, a bullet caught him in the shoulder. He staggered back, his rifle clattering to the ground. The tide was turning against them. Henderson's men were advancing, emboldened. Eli ran to Traeger's side, helping him to cover. They were pinned down. It was over. Then from down the slope came a new sound, a thunder of hooves, a lot of them. Over the ridge came a wave of riders, not gunmen. They were U.S. Marshals, a full posse, their badges glinting in the morning sun. Leading them was a man with a grim face and a sweeping mustache. He raised his hand and the posse fanned out, their rifles barking, systematically taking down Henderson's remaining men, who threw down their weapons in surrender. The marshal dismounted and walked over to Traeger, who was clutching his bleeding shoulder. I got your message, Jed, the marshal said. Took us all night to ride from Phoenix. Looks like we got here just in time. Traeger grinned through the pain. Your timing's always been terrible, Marcus. Another 5 minutes and we would have had this cleaned up. He had sent for them. The old lawman had known this was coming. He'd been one step ahead the entire time. It was finally over. In the aftermath, as the marshals rounded up the prisoners and tended to the wounded, Hannah handed the lockbox to Marshal Marcus. Inside was everything Silas had promised. The signed orders from Henderson, the maps of the stolen land, the proof of the massacre. The case was ironclad. They rode back into Prescott not as fugitives, but as heroes. The town watched in stunned silence as Marshal Marcus and his men stormed the Henderson house and arrested the most powerful man in the territory. Mrs. Henderson's pinched face collapsed in shock as her husband was led away in chains. The reign of terror was over. Weeks later, things had settled into a new kind of quiet. Traeger, his arm in a sling, had officially come out of retirement, agreeing to act as the new town sheriff until a permanent replacement could be found. The Yavapai, with Chayton as their representative and the evidence from the lockbox, were petitioning the federal government to have their stolen lands returned. The process would be long, but for the first time they had hope, and Hannah and Eli stood on the ridge where his cabin once stood. They had burned it to the ground themselves, cleansing the land of its painful memories. The cellar had been filled in, and a simple wooden cross marked Silas's final resting place. "What will you do now?" Hannah asked, looking out at the vast open country. Eli looked at her, his eyes clear for the first time since she'd met him. The ghosts were gone. "This land is still mine," he said. "Silas and we wanted to build something here. Something clean. I think I'd like to try again." He paused, then added, "But I can't do it alone." He wasn't asking for a housekeeper or a partner in a fight. He was asking for a partner in life. Hannah thought about the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach, alone and out of options. She thought about the gunfire and the fear, and the quiet moments of trust forged in the heart of the storm. She had come here looking for a place to hide, but instead she had found a place to stand, a place to fight, a place to belong. She smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "All right," she said, "but I get to pick the porch chairs." They had found more than just justice. They had found a home built not on grit and dust, but on the hard-won truth. A place where the secrets were finally brought into the sun. This story is a reminder that sometimes the greatest battles are fought in the quietest places, and the strongest people are the ones who have been broken and refuse to stay that way. It's about facing the ghosts of your past so you can build a future. So I have to ask you, what ghosts are you running from? What truth are you afraid to uncover? Let me know in the comments below, because every one of us has a secret locked in the cellar. And if this story of survival, justice, and redemption resonated with you, do me a favor and hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that stories of strength are worth sharing. And make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because there are a million stories buried in the dust out there, and you won't want to miss the next one we dig up.